Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast featuring Neil Smith, President General Manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup champion New York Rangers, and longtime ESPN NHL veteran Vic Morren. Together, they share no-nonsense opinions on news and issues around the National Hockey League. Whether you're a casual or diehard fan, each episode of NHL Wraparound will leave you more informed. Now, here's your hosts, Neil and Vic.
Welcome to a special edition of NHL Wraparound. Vic Morren and Neil Smith with you. And in about 6 weeks, training camps will open and the anticipation and excitement of another NHL season will begin. However, on July 24th, a trial showing hockey's unseemly side concluded in a London, Ontario courtroom. Our guest is unflinching in her coverage of difficult topics and joins us to speak about the trial, hockey's history of abuse, and the steps which need to be taken as the sport and society move forward.
Well, it's a pleasure now to have Katie Strang on NHL Wraparound. Katie is an investigative writer with The Athletic, but it has many years of journalism in her pocket, starting with teams and doing the normal sports beats that one starts with. But then, Katie, you seem to have really found your niche with investigative reporting, and you're at the top of your class in that now, I would say, from what I see out there. You and Rick Westhead seem to be the two people that you go to when you want to find out what really happened in these situations.
Well, thank you. That's good company to be considered amongst. Rick's a dear friend and a dogged journalist who I respect immensely. He's done terrific work, I think, in exposing a lot of the underbelly of sports. So I'm happy to be in company with him. But yeah, I mean, investigative was not something I set out to go into in terms of like a niche of journalism. But, you know, maybe 10 years or so into my career, became really, really interested in going down that lane. And grateful to The Athletic because they're the first place that really, I think, you know, empowered me to, you know, pursue stories that are investigative in nature, which take a ton of time and effort and resources to be able to execute.
And in your own home state was one of your first major stories, I know, and an ugly one with Larry Nassar. Is that the story or the time that really cemented your feelings that this was right in your laneway, that you were not something you would enjoy? I'm not suggesting that, but something that you felt you were good at.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's weird saying that I enjoy it. I don't know if that's like the appropriate way to articulate how I feel. I think the way that I feel about it is it's very purpose-driven work, and that feels very important to me. And, you know, I generally find, and this was like part of what drew me to The Athletic, is this ethos that, you know, what you care about and what you're passionate about will be reflected in the quality of your work. And so this has become, you know, both investigative journalism as a pursuit and then more as a subspecialty, like, you know, focusing on abuse, misconduct, gendered violence in sports is a bit more of like a niche that I've kind of discovered in the past 8 years or so. You know, that's something that I care very deeply about. And you're exactly right that the Larry Nassar case, I think, is what left that very indelible imprint on me, both personally and professionally. And it was like an interesting confluence of timing, being in the right place at the right time, and kind of, you know, I grew up a competitive gymnast. My coach went to jail for sexual abuse. You know, this happened at Michigan. You know, Larry Nassar is obviously affiliated with Michigan State at the time. I went to Michigan State. You know, I knew some folks that were victims. It was happening, you know, kind of in my backyard. So I was able to attend, you know, court more or less every every day. And so it was a very heavy, difficult assignment. But, I think that was like the first time I really took a, significant level of pride in the work that I was doing because it felt important to me.
Katie, how do you process and really detach yourself from that back into family life after you cover a story such as that?
Not always very gracefully, if you ask my husband. No, I mean, in all honesty, like I have a super, super supportive partner. He's amazing. I think he understands like the toll that it takes and gives me a lot of grace in terms of, that reacclimation period when you're dealing with very, very heavy material. And he's like proud of the work that I do too, I think. So I think he, knows when to give me a wide berth. And same with my kids, I feel like kids are sort of, they keep you honest and they also provide perspective in so many different ways. So even when I'm working on something, dark or serious or upsetting, I have like my kids' joy and laughter and, badgering me for snacks to like kind of bring me back down to earth. And so that has been really, I think, important for keeping a level of balance. And, I think having kids is an element of why this work is important to me, right? Like I want to treat every story like it were potentially my kids in the crosshairs so that, the world is a safer place, especially like when reporting on sexual abuse and stuff like that. People in power, authority, influence, abusing that level of power. So, I think about my kids a lot when I do that type of work.
Most recently, on July 24th, 5 players, former NHLers Michael McLeod, Dylan Dubé, Cal Foote, Alex Formanton, and Carter Hart were found not guilty of sexual assault by Justice Maria Carruccia. The witness was found not reliable or credible after the incident with members of this 2018 Canadian World Junior Hockey team when the witness, who goes by the moniker of EM, was 20 years old. But this trial, and you did some follow-up writing on it, was unusual to say the very least.
That is probably the most generous interpretation of how this trial went. Yeah, I mean, as we wrote in kind of the aftermath, it was like a circus from the start. I mean, 2 different juries were discharged. And I'll say that, as a lay observer and not someone that has legal acumen or, as a court reporter, so I'm not doing this like as my full-time job. I did find it like deeply problematic, offensive, upsetting, the way in which the juries were discharged. Not saying that that wasn't ultimately the right decision, but both juries, there were jurors that came forward with allegations of misconduct and impropriety on, against one particular defense counsel team. And I didn't feel like those allegations were like tested with a ton of rigor. There might be legal reasons for why that wasn't. And I don't even necessarily disagree that it would have been hard to maintain, the impartiality of the jury after allegations like that were made. But I did feel like the allegations should have been interrogated a bit more vigorously. And when both juries were dismissed, I felt like they kind of just treated those jurors a bit disrespectfully. They make this big show about, we are selecting 12 people from all different walks of life. And, we're entrusting you as independent triers of fact. And this is an awesome, really serious responsibility and privilege that you need to take seriously. And, here's how you do that, follow rules X, Y, and Z. And then I feel like as soon as they escalated like concerns about, things that they were warned, hey, please tell us if there are any concerns about this. I did feel like those concerns were kind of dismissed. So, I mean, that's, I'm rambling a bit, but, that was, I think the first mistrial kind of set the tone for the whole trial, which is there were going to be like really bizarro developments almost every day. Like, in the course of like an hour, I remember being in the lobby of the courtroom watching someone be arrested on suspicious of like furtively recording proceedings with his smart glasses, rode up on the elevator. And then as soon as we got off the elevator, like another public observer explodes on a reporter and, becomes sort of like very demonstrative to the point that he had to be banned from the premises. So, I mean, that's a 2 hour time, maybe 1 hour time frame that just gives you like a slice of how weird and unorthodox these proceedings were. There are two juries that were discharged. There were all sorts of like delays and issues with tech and, AC and the clocks didn't work. And it was an interesting reminder of, it's a trial where people's, lives and livelihoods are at stake. And, everyone puts a ton of like, effort and, sort of somberness into like a very serious affair. But, there's all these like weird mundane things that can derail proceedings and get in the way of a normal carriage of justice. And, it was a strange experience.
And even after the verdict was rendered by the justice, because this became a bench trial after the juries were dismissed, the view in public opinion was very split on the verdict. Rightly or wrongly, the line in the sand is clearly drawn here.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that probably reflects a few different things, which is, they were cleared, they were acquitted of criminal wrongdoing, of the charges, that they faced, right? And the Crown, the state or government, has the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is a very high bar, as it should be. These are very serious allegations. And the judge found that the Crown did not meet that onus. That burden of proof. And so they're acquitted of criminal wrongdoing. But I think a lot of people looked at the picture of what happened in the hotel room that night, not necessarily in just like the isolated context of case law and of, there being a moral component of that, of there being power dynamics potentially at play. And there's evidence that was not admissible or ruled inadmissible at trial that I think people, who are not sort of constrained by the parameters of the court are probably taking into consideration as well. And so, that doesn't surprise me that there is a bit of a split in public opinion. I think that's to be expected with such a high profile and polarizing case.
Katie, a lot of the things that we talk about or that you write about and that we read about in general life and is not this type of abuse. It is the allegations of sexual assault of near adults is not usually the case. It's more the Larry Nassar thing was with young girls. We can go on and talk about Graham James in a few minutes, and that was during my time. This was fringing on rape. I mean, this is a disgust. Even what I read, and I'm a former pro and junior hockey player and college hockey player. the stuff that I made me cringe, like that it was disgusting to me. And it must be hard for you to have to write the things that you had to write, because they're words that I don't even want to bring up on the show that you had to write. There were actions being taken by the young lady that were hard to read. There were certainly things done by those players, those young men, that they knew better than to be doing that stuff. They knew better than to be going to that hotel room. And whether they got off or not, they are stained, I think, for life. And you've got to wonder going forward, I don't see, and I'll just give my opinion first, any chance of these guys getting back into the NHL. But where do you think everything goes from here? I mean, the 5 names of those 5 players are all out there. We can name them off again. The name of the victim isn't out there. We just know those initials, EM. What happens from here with those 5 young men?
Yeah, so I remember, like, even before the verdict or the decision, which is what it's called when it's delivered by a judge, there was speculation about, whether any of these players would play again, which I think gives you a good sense of, like, that a lot of people were expecting or not surprised by the decision of across the board acquittals. I think given, like, the evidence that was ruled admissible and inadmissible, the judge had ruled on practically every matter of substance for the defense, that did not surprise a lot of people. But, it felt like some kind of trial balloons before that decision even came down, speculating about whether these players would play again or whether teams would explore signing them. And my feeling on that was always that was, like, one, I'm not super interested in that conversation in the context of my work, right? Because I don't cover the NHL, like, on a regular basis anymore. But I always felt like that probably skipped an important step or was missing sort of like an important component, which is, I had always felt like that, the NHL and Gary Bettman was going to probably, like, weigh in on whether or not they would be even eligible to return. And we did see that immediately, like, after the decision, he more or less said, hey, these players are not eligible. And he has incredibly wide latitude on determining their eligibility as afforded by the collectively bargained agreement. And so, Gary Bettman is criticized often about the NHL being, like, one of the major only, like, professional sports leagues that does not have a codified, sexual abuse and domestic violence policy. And I think that criticism is legitimate, by the way. Like, I think it behooves everyone to have that, like, sort of explicitly stated, codified and in writing. I do think that the reason the league wants that is I think Gary Bettman wants that wide latitude to be judge and jury and to be able to take these on case by case bases and determine whether, these players or in other cases should be eligible. And so, you saw the NHLPA come out pretty emphatically, pushing back on Gary Bettman's statement, which is interesting in the broader labor context because, for as long as I've, covered the NHL or issues adjacent to the NHL and having covered, different labor issues, but, between the NHLPA and the NHL, I would say that this is the stretch that probably, like, is significant for its, like, lack of enmity between the two sides. Like, it does feel like Marty Walsh and Gary Bettman have formed, like, a pretty strong working relationship where there have not been a ton of issues, and there seems to be quite a bit of collaboration. And so, when this might be one of the more interesting sort of like battles between those two sides that we see as part of this period of like, I don't ever truly believe in labor peace, but relative labor peace. And so I'll be very curious to see where that goes. But, the CBA is collectively bargained. And so those powers afforded to the NHL to ultimately like be the arbiter of whether those players are eligible or not, like, those were collectively bargained. And so, that's why Gary Bettman has those powers. Now it sounds like the PA is maybe pushing back on whether they feel like that actually is, afforded, those powers are afforded to him or not. But I think, ultimately what it'll come down to is whether, Gary Bettman decides to let them back. And one big thing that I think like people forget about is the NHL did conduct its own investigation. So not only does the NHL have like the complete totality of evidence, everything that came out in court over the span of 2 months, which is public record. They also are like, there's nothing to like prohibit them from considering the evidence that was not ruled admissible. Right. And then you have to imagine like the fruits of their own investigation probably yielded some additional information. Now, I don't know if that's exculpatory for the players or inculpatory or, maybe a little bit of both. But I have to imagine the NHL is privy to some details that we are not. And so it'll be interesting to see how hard the union pushes back on Gary Bettman's decision.
And then there's the next step, which is my background, which is, would one of the clubs want to really have this on their resume roster type thing? Certainly, for example, and we'll go to the Chicago thing for a minute. Carter Hart is from Alberta. We all know the Oilers lack in goaltending, if they lack in anything. And so, rumor starts right away. Well, what about Carter Hart to Edmonton? Well, was Stan Bowman really going to sign a guy who was up for sexual assault after what he went through as GM? And that ended his Hall of Fame run with the Chicago Blackhawks. And there has been other cases where teams have hired ex-players that were charged with physical assault, on a domestic physical assault. And there were people outside the building with signs saying, what do you, get this guy out of here. So would a club really want that hanging over them when we know things happened? I mean, it's not like they were accused, but they didn't do anything. They were in their room that night, and that was proven they never even left their room. They did stuff that was bad. And so I can't see clubs signing these guys. I wonder what your opinion is on that.
Okay, so I think you touched on an important point, which is that like what happened in much of what happened in that, what was alleged to have happened in that room that night is not in dispute. A lot of it, right? It's just a matter of whether there was consent. And so I think you're establishing a critical point. They're not saying we were never there, this never happened. It's just it's a dispute about whether she consented to that sexual activity and, other activities that took place in that room. I think my short answer to your question about whether teams will take the risk is I think they'll probably take their cues from Bettman. I think if he declares them eligible and clears them for signing, I think teams will consider it. If the NHL puts up a fight or shows resistance, I mean, do I see an owner trying to take on Gary Bettman over Carter Hart, who hasn't played meaningful games in quite a long time? No, I don't. I mean, what do you think, Neil? Like, you're the only one of us that's been a GM.
Well, I wouldn't want to, especially today now in 2025. I was GM in the 90s. This stuff didn't come out like this in the 90s. Was it going on? Probably, but it didn't surface like it does today because of the Me Too movement and all the rest of it, and rightfully so. So today I would not ever want that around. I know I wouldn't, because of I've just changed. I haven't changed my attitude. I just know what my attitude is today. I maybe didn't even know what my attitude would have been back in those days, because people had asked me, Katie, if you were Stan Bowman and Joel Quenneville, and it was happening during your run to break the 54-year jinx in 1994, and somebody came and said your video guy had done something with your prospect that you've brought along to find out, what would you have done? Well, it's easy for me to say, I would have turned him in right away. I would have, I would have taken a chance that we didn't break the curse in 54 years. It's easy to say that, but would you really have? You don't know, because you're not in that situation. But I can tell you that if I was GM or president today, I would not go near those guys after reading and knowing what went on.
Neil, then I'll ask you, how would this pertain to hiring a head coach? Now, obviously, neither Stan Bowman, Joel Quenneville, and President, VP of Hockey Operations, Al McIsaac, were guilty of a crime, yet they were banned for 3 years for inadequate response to the Brad Aldrich, Kyle Beach situation. And would there be the same type of concern for the backlash of having to hire somebody who's a proven winner? He may very well become the all-time winningest head coach, but where do you see the difference in the Quenneville hiring as opposed to players being allowed back in the NHL?
Well, what I see is the players took the actions themselves. If at the very worst, Quenneville and Bowman turned a blind eye to what they were told was going on. They didn't partake in anything. They just didn't do anything about it. When I say they just didn't, I don't mean that's acceptable. I mean that I think it's two different things. If you're asking me, would I hire Joel Quenneville? That's a really tough. I can't answer that, really, to be honest with you. I can't criticize Pat Verbeek for hiring him. I can't criticize the Oilers for hiring Bowman. You never know what you'll do until you're put in that situation.
Katie, I wanted to go back to something else to kind of bring this forward to the responsibility of the governing bodies, the NHL, Hockey Canada, because there is history of abuse in hockey. And as Neil had mentioned earlier, Graham James in the 1990s concerning Theo Fleury and Sheldon Kennedy, who were assaulted numerous times. James served 2 jail terms and then was granted full parole in 2016. You wrote a very revealing piece 2 years after that regarding 2 players, David Gove and Chris Weiss, who were abused by a prominent coach in the Boston area. And as we've seen all of these cases evolve over time, you've already mentioned the connection that Bettman and Marty Walsh and the NHL and the NHLPA have. But in terms of awareness, what is now the responsibility of these governing bodies since these stories have become so well publicized?
I mean, I think you have to first acknowledge that there are some systemic issues. And I think it's important not to be reductive and just and it's also not helpful to just completely condemn hockey culture as rotten, which I don't think is fair and or true. I think it is fair to acknowledge that there are real systemic issues and failings, and, that we have seen patterns like dating back decades and decades and decades of ritualized hazing, ritualized sexualized like hazing, sexual violence, especially with groups, sexual assaults. And so, I think it's important to think about it holistically as like, this is not just incumbent upon stakeholders to address because, it can cause harm to the community or people that players interact with. Like, it also harms the players. Like, players are being harmed, I mean, they're some of the stories of, the sexualized hazing that is deeply ingrained in junior hockey culture specifically is horrifying. And I actually again, I'll admit some of my own bias here. Like, I'm an American. And so the billeting system, I think culturally is more deeply ingrained in Canadian hockey culture. But, I think there's something that deserves like a harder look about, a young person being isolated from their nuclear family, and going to live with another family. And this is not I know there are many, many wonderful, amazing billets, but, you take a kid out of their home during a very formative time in their development, and they go live sometimes very, very far away, with people that they do not know. And, I think they spend an inordinate amount of time with teammates who might be, they might be 15 or 16. Their teammates could be 20. And that, that's a big developmental gap. There's a lot of life experience that happens in those times. And so I think, from what I've heard from junior hockey players, like your team really becomes your most central source of support and infrastructure. And when it's a healthy, positive team with good leaders and people that look out for you, that's wonderful. And that turns out great. And that can be a really positive experience for you athletically, socially, emotionally. But when it's not, it can be really corrosive, very insidious, toxic, abusive. And so, I do think it's interesting that, when we look back at, allegations of, sexual violence, there does seem to be a pattern with junior hockey. And so I do think that requires all of us, not just the governing bodies, but any sort of stakeholder, any person that really likes hockey and believes there are a lot of good people in hockey and wants to, see hockey at its best and to thrive and to produce top talent, but most importantly, kids that are fit and active and happy and healthy and have good, emotional well-being. I think that's on all of us. And, I should also say, I think there's this defensive, reflexive defensiveness when people critique hockey culture. And I think that's because hockey is a sport that's very insular. It can be very parochial, but it's also very central, I think, to players' identity and what a hockey player and what a hockey community should mean. And so I think when anyone is critical of hockey culture, it can really elicit a strong, visceral, reflexive, defensive reaction. And I think we should reframe that a little bit as, when you care about something, someone, an institution, a sport, a team, you should hold it to a higher standard, right? You should want to see it at its best iteration. I mean, I think when I was covering the Larry Nassar trial, that was certainly true for me. I went to Michigan State and had an unbelievable experience and held that place very special and dear to my heart as my alma mater. And, those are some of the best years of my life. And for that reason, not despite that reason, I was so wholly disappointed and disgusted by their systemic inaction And I think it's like, because I loved that place, it's incumbent upon me to be critical of it, right? It's when you love something, like you should want it at its best.
What do you see the media role in this? Because I mentioned when I did our open, you are unflinching in your approach. And I've had the privilege of talking about a couple of other stories that you have worked on. And we mentioned at the head, Rick Westhead, who has a book coming out in November called We Breed Lions. And it's made to create more awareness of attitudes in the dressing room, which, as you'd mentioned, continue to persist. There are a lot of great people, a lot of great billet families out there, a lot of great cultures around, but there is still this underlying problem that still exists. And from your perspective, can the media do more than what they're doing? Or is the reporting that we are seeing adequate as of right now?
Well, I mean, I think yes. I mean, the media can always do more. I would say, I think there's caveats to that, which is, the type of work that Rick and I both do takes an intense level of commitment from our outlets, right? And I'm happy speaking for Rick because I know how he feels about this. I think we feel a great level of gratitude and respect that we work for places that value that type of work and support that work, not just in words, but in putting the resources behind it. But it's not cheap to do. It's not easy to do. I think people would be surprised to know how long it takes to get the story of substance across the finish line, the exhaustive level of editorial and legal review you have to go through to be able to get across the finish line. And that for every 10 stories I take on, maybe 2 cross the finish line. And it's not for lack of effort or not because, the story is not true. It's just, it's hard work to be done. And it requires a lot of commitment and buy-in, not just from the reporter, but from the editor, from the outlet, from the outlet's legal team. And so, especially in a media ecosystem and environment where we're seeing constricting budgets, and entities raiding local news, and slashing staffs for profit, to help their bottom line. It's hard for me to feel critical of, a reporter that's not getting a lot of support or resources for not doing this type of work when you're trying to keep the lights on.
Katie, one last thing before we let you go. And I got to tell you that it's fascinating talking to you about this and listening to this because just the way that you're able to talk about it and explain things that one would not think about had they not been in the chair that you've sat in. But I do want to ask you one thing about concussions, because you've also written about concussions in the past. And concussions are, when I was GM of the Rangers, they were coming into focus back then. People were still wearing Jofa helmets, and meaning the thin little broomball helmets. And but not a lot was known about concussions. I remember being asked, when do you think Kevin Lowe will come back in the lineup after he had suffered a concussion? And I said, the hard part about his injury is that it's a brain injury. And I said, when you have a wrist or leg injury, the brain tells you when you can skate or play. But when it's the brain that's injured, there isn't something there to tell the brain is ready to play. And the reporters sort of laughed at me, thought, oh, this is Neil joking around again. And I was totally serious. And now today, this is obvious that these are brain injuries. And is the sports world, and I guess we got to get it down to football and hockey, but are they doing enough to address the very, very serious issue of brain damage, not only to kids that are in those leagues, but also to up and comers that are playing high school or that are playing in some little league football that can end up getting a concussion at 12 years old or on like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, our attitudes and understanding of traumatic brain injuries have evolved quite a bit, even from when I first started covering hockey, almost 20 years ago. And I think, from your response to the Kevin Lowe question, you were clearly ahead of your time. But sometimes, it takes a lot of not even necessarily scientific or empirical evidence to shift culture and social understanding and mores about a topic. A lot of times there's a lot of different factors that go into that. And so I think it's shifting, it's evolving. Do I think it's, where it needs to be? No. I mean, Gary Bettman has still not, acknowledged, to my understanding, the connection between, repeated, blows to the head and, traumatic brain injuries and CTE. And I think until that, connection is acknowledged, I think you can very easily say that we have a long way to go. And I think the other thing that as it relates to CTE and concussions, that I think we're having an increased level of awareness and understanding about is sort of the echo of trauma when it comes to repeated brain injuries, not just CTE, which, are generally diagnosed posthumously, but all the different manifestations that, people have after they've suffered significant brain injury, which is depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety, substance use disorder. So I think having a more holistic awareness of all the other things that can, be these very unfortunate byproducts of head injuries are increasingly important for us to understand. Also, as it relates to not just the young kids coming up, but for NHL players that, have retired and require a great amount of care and support and resources. I think there's a great deal to be done to help those folks who I think are really struggling.
I agree with you totally. I'm being around the Dynasty Islanders a lot myself, who are attending the current day Islander games. Certainly, some of those guys have talked about the fact that they have memory loss and such. But Katie, we don't want to keep you here all day. I look forward to reading your next articles. I always enjoy them. Well, see, again, enjoy is the wrong word. I always find them intriguing and illuminating of the issue. Thank you so much for doing this with us. It's been an offbeat thing for Vic and I. We usually have a hockey person, a GM or someone sitting where you're sitting. And so this is, hopefully our listeners will find it as or more interesting than I think Vic and I both find you on this show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Katie. Neil, that's some real heavy stuff. And the first time that we have gotten into anything even close to this, and we called this particular episode Pulling Back the Curtain. And it was to really get insight into a difficult topic, and topics, if you include the concussions, that most people really don't get to hear inside stories the way that Katie presented them to us.
And she's a fascinating interview because she's doing a job that most people wouldn't want to do. I mean, to be honest with you, if there's a lot of people who don't like you just because you're reporting the truth, then they don't want to hear the truth. They don't want to hear that this stuff is going on. And it's a difficult job. You're going to create enemies. But as she said, and I admire this, she really feels good about her work because she feels it's important, and it's important to try to stop this kind of behavior.
And she does it so well. And I think when you mention Katie and Rick Westhead in the same breath, these are the two people that can really continue to make an impact as hockey continues to evolve.
And all the other sports and all the other places this can go on. And let's hope that, as Katie said, you've got businesses cutting back in places. And let's hope that there's always a platform for Rick and for Katie to be able to work at, to be able to get this information out to the public to try to help put an end to this.
There's no question. And one of our most revealing interviews in almost 20 months that you and I have been together doing this. That'll wrap up our show for today. Thanks to our listeners. Send questions or comments to NHLWraparound@gmail.com. Remember that all of our podcasts are on all platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube, and our complete catalog can be found on our website, NHLWraparound.com, which is undergoing a facelift, and we should be having the update coming out probably by the end of August. And also, continue to get the word out on our show as our subscriber list continues to grow. Our summer coolers coming up on August 20th, 22nd, 25th, and 27th. But perhaps Neil and I will even drop another show with a celebrity next week. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching today.
Thanks for joining us on the NHL Wraparound podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all the NHL action.